and I'm very glad to finally meet you. My first question is, how did you personally experience the outbreak of COVID-19, and how did you respond to it?
Listen, it's an interesting story, and I should confess that probably I've experienced better than I deserved. But it all started, I was in the United States in January, when basically the talk on COVID-19 started, and I should confess that I basically missed the issue. I was there, I had a dinner, and there was an American diplomat doing then the Wuhan and all this. And for me, this was like Ebola. I expected that this is going to be taken care, that it's not going to reach us. And then somewhere in the beginning of March, I got a call from a journalist friend who for the last 2 weeks was reporting just on COVID-19 from Berlin. And he told me, listen, this is serious. Be prepared that the borders are going to be closed and we are going to experience something that we have not experienced before. At the moment when I got this call, my daughter was in Spain. So first it was 2 days negotiations with my daughter to come back. And this was already the beginning of March, and we start to basically understand that something is changing. And then when she came back, the decision was where we should be during the lockdown, which was now obvious that is going to come. And we're living mostly in Vienna. We are Bulgarians, basically coming back. And this was an interesting conversation within the family. My wife, being a much smart and rational person, told me, listen, the hospitals in Vienna are better. My response was, but we know the doctors in Bulgaria. Which is different. And we decided to go back to Bulgaria, and a very generous friend of ours invited us, he's a wine producer, to stay with him in the countryside. So as a result of it, for the next 70 days, we stayed, just these two families. This is very much in the deep countryside. You're not seeing any people. We have been really locked down. And somewhere on the second week came the call from my German publisher, and she said, are you ready to reflect on what is going on? And to be honest, in any other circumstances, I was going to say no. But then I realized one thing. On something like COVID, you either should write very early on in the process or when it is over. Because writing in the middle of it, you're going to be so confused that you don't have a chance. So this is how all this happened.
So how long did you stay in Bulgaria? You're not in Bulgaria now.
70 days. Now I'm in Vienna because we went back because the schools opened, and our son, who is 11-year-old, basically had to go to school. So we had our PCR tests. We came in May back to Vienna. Then for the summer, we have been back in Sofia. And since a week, I'm back in Vienna.
But it's also an interesting point in your book that COVID also raised the question of belonging, and where do we belong? What is our home, and what does home actually mean to us?
No, exactly. Listen, when you're asking stay home, this is an interesting question, particularly for people who basically live in more than one place. You can have 2 apartments, but you have just one home. Yes. And from this point of view, for me, and this was very strongly, was that in the moment of total uncertainty and crisis, you should go also in the environment where you basically culturally feel safer. Let's put it like this. This is also back to the language. And also, of course, we have been very much worried about our relatives and what is going on. And not that during these 70 days we are seeing my mother or my wife's father, but the very fact that we are nearby for us was critically important.
It was very interesting in the beginning. I was actually in America in February, and I heard people talking about COVID-19. And I said to my son, you know, Americans are always crazy about some threats coming from somewhere. And he said, well, we should go to Chinatown in Boston because there'll probably be a lot of racism against Chinese now. So we did that, and that was all we thought about with COVID-19. So I was actually even slower than you to realize that it was something critical. But at that point, it was like all over the world, we were occupied by the same thing at the same time. There was a new global feeling of, this is a common problem. I don't think we're there anymore. It's like they're obsessed by it in America still, but here in Denmark, it's not so important. How do you see this transition from a global event where everyone is preoccupied with COVID, and now we're different places and different stages in COVID?
Listen, in the beginning, it was the shock of unknown, unexpected, threatening, and we have been in the same world. I do believe for several weeks, the world was living in the same world. For example, you can see this if you are just an ordinary person who is never interested in anything about politics or international relations, and you're changing the channel somewhere in March or April.
Yeah.
And you can go on Arab television or Turkish television and so on, and you don't know a word, but you know what they're talking about, because everybody was talking about COVID. And from this point of view, there was this moment in which everybody was there, people all the time constantly comparing what is happening in their country with what is happening in other countries, how many infected, how many died, what is going to happen. But at the end of the day, this was a very different experience with COVID. Listen, Bulgaria also is a country in which the number of infected and the number of people that have died for the moment is relatively low. Denmark for sure is like this. But when I was talking to my friends in New York, already in May and June, you can understand that the geography was totally different.
Yeah.
They have not been leaving their apartments for 4 months. They're basically living in a totally different situation. And I do believe this is also what is happening. In the beginning, we have been together. And after that, basically, we became very much to differentiate. And what is most interesting is politically, suddenly, the countries which were most successful to contain the virus, people are becoming kind of more skeptical and
Yes.
think why this was needed. So in a certain way, because nothing bad happened, people decided that nothing serious has happened. While in countries like Italy or United States, particularly, I was talking to people in New York, for the moment, COVID-19 is the only issue. This has dramatically changed their lives. While in Bulgaria, you're going to see a lot of people, the majority of the population, doubting how serious is all this. There is no conspiracy theory that we are not ready to subscribe for.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's also happening now that we don't know what state we're in. In the beginning, it was like a state of exception. I know not constitutionally, legally, but it felt like a state of exception. And back in March, April, we were saying to each other, when all this is over, when we return to normalcy, then we'll have this and like that, and we'll go back to life. And we said, maybe COVID will last for 2 years, or maybe it will be over in 3 months. But I'm a little confused as to where we are now, because we're not in a state of exception, but we're not back to normalcy. And it's like we have this indefinite horizon where it will be part of our lives. How would you characterize the place we're in with COVID now in Europe?
Listen, this is an interesting story, because anytime when you have something so important and so challenging like this pandemic, you have the feeling that the world is going to change dramatically. Yes. For example, and this happened to us at least 3 times. This was the case after 9/11, particularly when the Americans are saying the world is not going to be the same. And then after the global financial crisis and after the refugee crisis, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, we have this feeling. And the story is that, of course, the world is changing. It's never changing totally, but also we're starting to assume the change. Many things that till yesterday, for us, was totally unusual. We start to live with them as if something is around. For example, have you noticed that much more before COVID-19, if you're on the international airport, you're going to see a lot of Asians with facial masks.
Yes.
And for us, this was, for me at least, this was kind of strange. I didn't understand what all this was about, because we forget that 20 years ago, there was the SARS epidemics, and which basically made the facial masks plus the climate problems also, and the pollution of the air. But suddenly, this is the same that is happening to us. Even this type of a conversation, even a year ago, you're going to be quite reluctant to have a discussion of a book online. And to be honest, I'm one of those who are not particularly fond of this type of conversation, but now it is a new normal. So when we're trying to see what has changed, we're even not going to notice how many things are going to stay with this. But the interesting story about pandemic, and this historically for me was a kind of a small discovery, is that pandemics probably has shaped the world not less than wars and revolutions. But the problem is that they cannot be remembered. And they cannot be remembered because even when millions of people are dying, like with the Spanish flu, there is not a narrative. We are dying without meaning. Everything is arbitrary. If you're dying in a war, the nation state is going to tell you that you don't simply die, you sacrificed your life. But if you're basically dying in a pandemic, you have no story to tell. What I can tell people, we were joking with my wife, that heroic story that we can tell is that we have been saving humanity by staying with a friend and drinking wine. Yes. This is not, this is not really the story that you can tell. And this is why I do believe that probably what we're going to forget is exactly this incredible experience of the last 2 or 3 weeks, in which we experience the world very differently. Then we're going back to a kind of a certain type of normality, but this normality is very different. Different is the way we're working. Different is the way basically we are dating. Different is the way we're writing and what we expect to happen. So this is the story, and the world is going to be torn apart between nostalgia for the pre-COVID-19 world, when we have been easily traveling, doing this and that. People who basically hated the pre-COVID-19 world, are now nostalgic for it. But on the other side, COVID-19 radicalized the imagination of a lot of people. For example, if you're a climate activist,
yes,
and you always wanted all these planes to be landed because they're polluting so much, but you never believed that it really can happen. And then overnight it happened.
Yes.
Or if you're a radical nationalist, you always wanted the borders within Europe to be resurrected. You hoped about this, but you don't really believe it's going to happen. And then overnight it happened. So from this point of view, nostalgia, but also the radicalization of the imagination of certain groups of the population, this is something that I do believe the post-COVID-19 world is going to be about.
But because from a political standpoint, there are some who say, well, COVID-19 will definitely be the end of globalization as we know it. It will be the end of a certain kind of neoliberalism. And you know, we hear in Information, when they write in the Financial Times, when they write in the conservative Financial Times that that COVID-19 laid bare the frailty of the social contract, said, yes, we were right all along, it's all over. But then there are other people saying, well, it was like that with the financial crisis as well. Francis Fukuyama was writing an essay called The End of Market Fundamentalism. And we were writing exactly the same things at that time. So some of us would say, well, now things can change politically. And others would say, well, this is a state of exception. There are so many interests, so much power invested in taking it back to normality again. How do you see this from politically?
Listen, I do believe that it's going to be a change, but in a certain way, people are trying to see the change in the way the change was working before. For example, people that have been very much critical to the market expected the resurrection of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal coming back. But something different was perceived. And I was also looking to the survey which the European Council on Foreign Relations did in the middle of May. And here's the interesting story. Listen, people understood that the globalization and basically the globalized market cannot save us in the case of emergency like this. And certain things that were known before, but we try not to notice, suddenly became noticeable. For example, 180 tradable products, important, keep tradable products. 70% of the export is coming from one country. So we have been totally dependent on China or India for certain medicines, for certain products. And in the moment of the crisis, you understand what it means. You cannot get a simple facial masks. So from this point of view, of course, it is a crisis of the global supply chains. You understand that in the moment like COVID-19, you cannot rely on them. On the other side, and this is interesting, people are saying that the big government is back. The government is back, but unlike in the 1930s, I do believe we're in a situation in which people mistrust the market, but they mistrust the state too. And strangely enough, what they expect from the government is not so much to manage the economy, which was the expectation in the 1930s,
Yes,
but they
exactly.
expected very much what I'm calling the stockpile state. People wanted to be sure that if something goes wrong, the state is going to have a reserve of everything that we need.
Yes.
That we're not going to depend on the market, but on the other side, there is no real push, for example, for nationalization. Even when the nationalization happened because of the crisis, because of certain companies, particularly air companies and so on, being de facto bankrupt, people didn't cheer it. And this is the interesting story. Before it was like this. In the 1920s, after the Great Depression, people lost trust in the market, but they regained trust in the government. In the 1970s, people lost basically trust in the big government, but they started to trust the market. And now basically people are trustful both to the market and the state, and they're trying to find a way how to deal with this, understanding that you're going to need both the market and the state for things to operate, but you don't have the feeling that market is the solution. But of course, the idea that market is the solution and that globalization can go back where it is, I don't believe this is going to be true. And I was reading, talking about Financial Times. Financial Times had an interesting study showing that in the next 5 years, they expect around 30% of the global trade routes to be reshifted, which means not simply because of the COVID-19, but because of the political instability, because of the rise of probably of prices of labor in China, we're not going to have the same geography that we have now. In 5 years, we're not going to have 80% of the medicines coming from India. Governments are not going to allow it anymore. By the way, in this study of the ECFR, 52% of the French and 54% of the Germans said that they're ready to pay higher price for the medicines, but they insist these medicines to be produced within Europe.
That's so. Who are, if you say, I think it's a very convincing view of history and the victory of government in the 30s, the victory of the market in the 70s, and the defeat of both in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. But that, of course, leaves the question: who are the ideological winners of the COVID-19 at this point?
Listen, this is also a very good question, because when it started as a question, and I remember when I was trying basically to get some data for the research in this very early period, there was the idea that authoritarianism is winning, or there was the idea no, authoritarianism is losing. If you go closer to the data, you're going to see that at least for the moment, and things can change, but for the moment, the nature of the regime is not the strongest predicator of how successfully you're doing. There were democratic countries that did very well, by the way, Denmark being one of them. But South Korea was doing fine. And there were some authoritarian regimes like Vietnam or China who basically did relatively well. There was authoritarian regimes that did terribly. And you are seeing what is happening in Belarus.
Yes.
And there was an effect of COVID-19. By the way, Russia didn't do very well. You are seeing what happened in the United States. So the interesting story was researchers basically came up with 3 other factors that on this level were very important to understand what is going on. One was social trust. Listen, in a moment like this, people should trust the government. There is no government which is so powerful to basically arrest everybody who is not washing his hands. So you should basically convince people. They should believe that this is in their interest. And social trust is also quite high in some of the authoritarian regimes, but in general, basically, the democracies are doing better on social trust. The second is capacity of the state, not simply the money going to health, but also the capacity to communicate. And to be honest, from this point of view, smaller states or states which are much more decentralized are doing better. You know better, it's much more specific, you're not there. And certainly was also the experience with crises like this. It's not by accident that countries like South Korea are doing fine. They had it 2 decades ago. It's not so accident that China was not bad prepared. I'm saying this, but there is one question which for me was very interesting, and it is in the book. I was thinking about this after that, and I do believe from this point of view, the Belarus story comes convincingly for me. Listen, normally you expect that authoritarian leaders are going to like crises like this because they like everything that consolidates their power. These are leaders that basically bet on fear, and they're fluent in politics of fear. But if you see the reaction of different type, either classical authoritarian leaders or much more authoritarian style leaders like Bolsonaro or Trump, you're going to see that their initial reaction was to deny the crisis. Mr. Lukashenko never basically said that there is something serious about COVID-19. He even didn't stop football games. Mr. Trump, it took him quite a while to understand how big the threat is for the United States. The same for Bolsonaro. By the way, in Russia, President Putin, who normally likes to be the leader in moments like this, he simply disappeared, and it was the mayor of Moscow, Mr. Sobyanin, who played the game. Why is this? And my major argument is that the most important freedom that every authoritarian leader wants is the freedom to choose the crisis he's going to respond for. Basically, authoritarian leaders like when they don't like certain crisis to replace it with another crisis. And from this point of view, the problem with the COVID-19 was that it was such an overwhelming crisis that you cannot replace it with anything else. You cannot simply tell people, it's a small war here, or we are going to have the migration problem there, because everything about COVID-19, people are dying. Hospitals have been, in most of these countries, totally full. So from this point of view, I do believe it is wrong to believe that authoritarian leaders like crises like COVID-19. Normally, they like crises that they can manufacture themselves.
That's a very strong point, but it's in the book as well, as you mentioned. So there are a lot of people now saying, well, this is the end of the American century, that they used to be the country that people look to for a solution, and now they're looked upon as the worst case scenario. And it's not that China is doing very well, but they're not inferior to America anymore. And no one expects American leadership on this crisis. How do you see the geopolitical shifts in the world order emanating from COVID-19?
Listen, this is a great question, and the interesting story is that if you see on this survey that I quoted already twice, one of the major impact, particularly for the Europeans, of the crisis was how lonely we felt in this crisis.
Yes.
Only 2% of the Europeans declared that America was a useful ally. We are so much used to America leading, and America was nowhere to be seen. And even in a very pro-Atlantic places like Denmark, like Germany, on the question how the COVID-19 affected your view of the United States, more than 60% of the people said our view of the United States deteriorated. And I do believe this is quite important because this time it's not only about Trump.
No.
It was about the health system. It was about how polarized American society is. And people start asking question, can America lead in a situation like this? Because I do believe we are seeing in the United States really a profound crisis of political identity. One of the characters in the John Updike's novel was claiming, what is the meaning of being American if there is not Cold War? And I do believe that this is quite important because comparing the crisis in the United States now compared with the 1970s, Huntington back then wrote a book which I found quite interesting, in which he said, listen, there is a major crisis in the United States, but this is the crisis of disappointment. People are attacking American institutions from the American ideals. They're saying why American institutions are not living up to the ideas of American dream. What I see in this crisis is something different. There is quite a lot of people who are not buying American dream anymore. And from this point of view, it's much more fundamental. As a result of it, it does not mean that America is going to disappear as a major power. And by the way, one of the interesting stories about the United States is to see a total kind of desynchronization between the performance of the American market and the American society.
Yes.
American society is doing bad. People on the street, there are a lot of unemployed people. Only 13% of the Americans declare that country is going into the right direction. At the same time, the American stock market is overperforming. And I do believe this is also something that we should look around. So as a result of it, what I expect in a geopolitical terms is the following. I really do believe that the United States cannot go back to our position that it was in a pre-Trump period. And to be honest, Trump is not the only reason for this. There was also major economic and other changes. Of course, he made it emotionally much more different for everybody. China will try, of course, to use the opening, but also the moment China is trying to do it, you see that there's going to be a backlash also against the Chinese ambitions everywhere. In the same survey, you can see that in every single country that we polled, with the exception of my own Bulgaria, as a result of this crisis, basically the view on China deteriorated. People became much more hostile. They basically start to see much more the power-hungry authoritarian face of China. So what I expect, and this is a hypothesis that can turn wrong, but I do believe that strangely enough in the next 10 years, the most active are going to be the middle powers because suddenly their world was destabilized. This, on one level, of course, players like European Union, but Japan, South Korea, India, Turkey, Russia, all these countries that have been finding their place in the previous world, either aligned with the Americans or resisting them, suddenly they see a lot of uncertainty and they're going to do different things. Some of them will try probably to make alliances between themselves. By the way, the European initiative on the vaccines was something like this. Others, like Russia and Turkey, went very aggressive. I'm never going to forget 2 years ago, I was visiting Ankara and talking to a minister in the Erdogan government who, discussing Syria, told me a sentence I'm never going to forget. He said, Ivan, you should know, World War II is over, but World War I has not finished yet. This kind of a return to old imperial maps, old kind of imperial sensitivities. You can feel it. You can feel it with Turkey in the Ottoman space. You can feel it with Russia in the post-Soviet space. And this is part of kind of disintegration of the post-Cold War world. And I'm sure that you're going to feel in other places. Where you also write, based on the surveys in China, you can see that as a result of the COVID-19, the Chinese population get much more self-confident about their own political system.
Yes.
10 or 15 years ago, Chinese were basically happy with their economic growth, but they were very much envying the political institutions of the West. Now, there also is a result of a propaganda, but also of what they see as the American response to the crisis, they start to believe that their system is superior and that it's kind of a Chinese time.
So it's fair to say that the moral superiority of liberal democracy and the certainty that our systems are more attractive than any other systems has kind of faded after COVID-19. It's very difficult to see who are the winners. You can see shades of a new order, but what we believe to be the morally and politically and culturally superior regimes are no longer as evidently superior. Is that correct?
It is correct. And to be honest, it started even before COVID-19. COVID-19 simply intensified this. I was very much struck by a pan-European survey which Bertelsmann Foundation did a year ago, which was only among people who are younger than 30, I do believe rightly. And the question was, what kind of a regime is going to do better in fighting climate change? And suddenly, you have the majority of these young Europeans only saying the authoritarian regimes are better positioned to fight climate change. And for me, this was a surprise. This is also true that many of these people do not have a very clear idea what exactly it means to live in authoritarian regimes, because this is probably the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. In a certain way, democracy does not look very well seen from outside because it looks quite messy.
Yes.
But from time to time, living inside could be quite comfortable. While I can be very much listening to people praising, for example, Putin's Russia and so on. And the truth is that, particularly on foreign policy and other things, President Putin achieved a lot and Russia looks very strong from outside, but you don't want to be inside. You don't want to live. You don't want to live there. And I found this, but this is going to be many of the self-evident things for us. Democracy is always more competitive than authoritarian regimes. People are always going to side with democracy and so on. All these have been questioned. So I don't believe that basically COVID-19 gave an answer to questions, but it legitimized all these questions. So now you cannot tell it all, but it's obvious. It's not obvious. I do believe basically some democracies did very well, some democracies did very badly, and this is also quite clear.
For the year, and I should emphasize that your book is primarily about Europe. And in the beginning of the crisis, we were writing editorials that were, of course, absolutely true, but now, half a year later, doesn't look as convincing as they did back then about this could be end of the European Union. And you see Germany and France breaking the basic principles of the European Union. Everything you have told the UK, you cannot be part of the European Union and not complying with it. You cannot be a part of the inner market if you don't comply with these rules. They were breaking them themselves. And it was like the European Union had no authority to impose their principles and their rules on sovereign nations. And we were saying, well, this could be the end of the union. This is something we say every 2 or 3 years. But now it seems to me that the European Union could emerge a lot stronger from this crisis with the recovery fund and the new budget and Angela Merkel's turnaround. How do you see that?
Listen, I very much agree with you, because normally I always like being a classical East European. I never was taking European Union for granted. Is one of us particularly coming from Eastern Europe, we have seen the collapse of something that looks very stable. Bulgarian communism in 1980s was like nature. You can hate it as much as you want, but you believe that it's going to stay for the next 100 years. And it collapsed over weeks. So from this point of view, we were very much more aware of the fragility of the project. But even in the book, which was written primarily basically in April, my major story was that European Union is going to benefit from this crisis. And here is my argument. First of all, I was less worried about this nationalistic mobilization that happened in the early weeks of the crisis. Closing of the borders, everybody going after national interest, for 3 reasons. The first is, listen, this is the initial reaction of every government that should try to convince their public that the situation is under control. In a high level of uncertainty, listen, if you're a government and there is a major crisis and you don't know what to do, the best thing to do is to close the borders. Even if you don't know why, you are telling people that I'm in charge, I'm taking responsibility. Yeah. But secondly, this type of a nationalism that we saw during this initial stage of the COVID-19 crisis is very different than the nationalism during the refugee crisis. For example, in Eastern Europe, it was very ethnic. To be honest, it was about Bulgarians and others, Hungarians and others, Czechs and others. It was about origin. This stay-at-home nationalism was very much about residence. For example, migrants have been treated quite well when they are in the country, to the extent that Portugal said in the beginning of the crisis, listen, we're not going to make distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, because if non-citizens get infected, obviously this is going to infect others. So, but at the same time, people were not particularly also keen of the diaspora people coming back. I don't believe that basically Bulgarian public was highly enthusiastic that people like me decided to come back to Bulgaria, which was going to be the case in the refugee crisis, because they said now these people can come with the virus. So this was one of the reasons I do believe that this type of nationalism was much more inclusive. It was not kind of a classically xenophobic one. Secondly, this is like when you were told to stay in your apartment and not to leave. It's nice in the beginning, but then you understand that you cannot stay there forever. And this is what happened when you close the border. You close the borders just to understand how much you depend on people who are outside of your borders. For example, Austrians understood how much they depend on all these people who are crossing the border every single day. They're living in Slovakia or Czech Republic or Hungary, but they work in Austria. So suddenly when the borders were closed, it was the Western countries that started to come with the charter flights to get East European workers in order to go to do the agricultural field. So from this point of view, also this crisis exposed the economic limits of nationalism, particularly if you're a small state, you cannot stay closed all the time. This is simply not functional. And people understanding this also on a generational level, for me, it was interesting to notice, we have in the Institute some young researchers, 25, 26. For the first time in their life, they discovered that there are borders. For the first time, a young Czech girl understood that she cannot go to Vienna anytime she wants. And this is how European Union and basically freedom of movement was rediscovered, because we normally value something after we're losing it.
Yeah.
And this was, but the second reason why I do believe I was slightly more optimistic about this was that, by the way, we have a lot of data showing that majority of people all over Europe were not impressed by the initial reaction of the European Union. We have a good explanation, and of course, European Union does not have much powers when it comes to public health. But people said, for example, Italians, where is Europeans when we needed them?
Yes.
But at the same time, now 70% of Europeans said we need more European cooperation. We are ready to allow European Union to tax, carbon tax. We are going to allow digital tax. So suddenly, I do believe what Europeans discovered is that if the world is really going wild, if basically Americans are not what they used to be, if Chinese are coming much less pleasant than we hope they're going to be, the only thing that on which you can rely is Europe. Europe is now becoming for people not simply community of choice, but community of faith. And I do believe this explains this strange story in which you have the nationalist moment and the Europe moment at the same time. So you're going to have a major federalist breakthrough in Europe without having a federalist sentiment. So this is not that people said, I like European Union because I dislike my nation state. People are saying, listen, I trust much more my nation state, but for my nation states to have any relevance, we should empower the EU. And I do believe this is a new situation. And if the European leaders manage to capture it, this is going to be a great success, because this crisis did not divide people on pro-European and anti-European in the way they have been divided, by the way, by the refugee crisis or even by the global economic crisis. And in Germany, I do believe this is very much what you're saying, because it was the same chancellor who took a decision totally different than on the previous crisis.
Yes.
Because I do believe she realized exactly this. But also she felt the sentiment. During the global financial crisis, if you're German, you can say, okay, Greeks are to be blamed for what happened to them. You cannot say it during this crisis. Italian or Spaniards are to be blamed for being infected. And I do believe this is also kind of, there is no such a moralizing about the failure of the others. Because in the moment of a public health disaster, we all are vulnerable. And this shared vulnerability, in my view, is the new strength of Europe.
But it seems to me also that actually something that was being planned or thought out by the European Commission even before COVID-19 now all of a sudden seems relevant to people. Absolutely. Because you had the new Ursula von der Leyen and talking about the European Union being a geopolitical power, and people are like, blah, 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 European geopolitical power. And now you see, okay, maybe we shouldn't be so dependent on China. Now maybe we should have supply chains from other countries than China or the US. And you saw in the spring the European Union talking about a different kind of globalization, not the fair and level playing field that they used to talk about, but celebrating the idea of European champions. And it seems that what they were preparing were kind of different globalization, and they were telling their citizens that if you cherish the principles that your societies are based upon, then we have American tech capitalism that we cannot defend ourselves against, that we have Chinese state capitalism. And now it's like people realize what is at stake. So this Ursula von der Leyen project and the project of the new commission has actually been strengthened and emphasized by this COVID-19 crisis.
Totally, totally. No, and listen, like you, I do believe that the commission was right to see where the problem was, but the public was not on the same page.
Yes.
So suddenly it was COVID-19 that basically pushed the ordinary citizens to see the world in the way many of the commissioned people, and particularly von der Leyen, was seeing it. Because the story before was European Union was perceived by many as a vehicle of globalization because it was about opening, it was about trade, it was about doing this or that. But suddenly, I do believe what von der Leyen understood is, if the world goes protectionists, if China is going to go about itself, if the United States basically decide also to do this, the only kind of a possible type of protectionism in Europe is on the continental level. I don't believe that Bulgaria can get protectionist. To be honest, I also don't believe that Denmark can get protectionist because basically we're too small. And then what is interesting, and this is the geopolitical part of it, we understand the following. When you are making a carbon tax, you're simply telling people, okay, we cannot convince you to do something together about the environment. We are not powerful enough. You are not worried enough. But then we are telling you the following. If you're going to produce in the way we believe is harming the nature, we're going to tax you. We're going to make your access to the European market very difficult. So we really started to use European power, particularly the power of the consumer market of the European Union, to influence the world. If you want to basically sell in the European Union, you should produce in a certain way. And the same goes with the digital tax. Okay, probably we cannot regulate the Chinese and the Americans, particularly if they go on their own, because then there is no Commonwealth to regulate. But then we're saying, listen, but we're going to tax you. And I do believe this is new, and I'm going to call it as a kind of a form of progressive protectionism. You are not simply trying basically to protect your businesses, but you are using your protectionism to try to influence the world into the direction which you don't believe that you can use simply on your example. This is a direct, totally redefining the soft power of the EU. And here I very much agree with you that von der Leyen was the person who saw it right. It's not by accident that she's coming from the security sector. Of course, it was also not by accident that she's a medical by profession. So from this point of view, people were disappointed with the Commission because you wanted somebody to be around. Commission didn't have much options, to be honest, to do much if the nation states were not interested. But in a long term, the Commission was prepared for the turn that happened. Of course, the investment in research, the only area in which I do believe von der Leyen was much more enthusiastic, and the national governments are not ready to go with his on the security sector, on the hard power story. If you see basically any funding which is about defense is very much cut.
There's another great point in your book, which is that at first hand you think, well, this COVID-19 crisis is give the national leaders a new authority. They can use tools that we're not used to seeing them using, like banning public gatherings and telling people to stay home. And we're not used to seeing this in a democracy. We say, well, this is okay because we know the crisis. But there's a point in your book which I find, I didn't think of it at all before I read it. Maybe it was obvious to a lot of other people, but I thought it was very interesting. You say that, well, this was empowering the national leaders, but at the same time, it was also empowering the citizens. How is that?
Well, listen, it is an interesting moment. And don't forget, when a crisis like this happens, we normally react in the way we reacted on a previous crisis that looks like it. For example, when the governments come with the state of emergency, when the parliaments were basically sent home, when the executive power concentrated so much prerogatives, people started to say, this is the anti-terrorist legislation coming back again, everything is about surveillance, the governments are becoming totally overpowerful and unaccountable. And my argument goes on three levels. it is one thing to come with a state of emergency in a single country because of a local crisis.
Yeah.
It is totally different to have a state of emergency all over. Why? Because you all the time compare what the others are doing. And this is, listen, this is a classical, there was a famous book by Frank Knight, 1921, by the way, just after the Spanish flu. And his major argument is the difference between uncertainty and risk. So in March and April, COVID-19 crisis was uncertainty embodied. You don't know how to react because you don't have data. You basically don't have a history, what you can do. And when you don't know what to do what others do. Because if you're government, for a very simple reason, not because the others are right, but because if you decide to do something on your own,
yes,
and if it goes wrong, you're going to be very much attacked for this. From this point of view, I had a huge respect for what the Swedish did, not because of the content, but because of the daring. Yeah. Because you can see what is happening to them. Basically, because everybody did something else, the moment it didn't work in the way they expected, their own citizens are saying, why you don't do like the Danes? So the governments have this instinct in the moment of total uncertainty to do the same things. And then the people start to compare. For example, I'm Bulgarian government, and there's certain type of policies that have been put by my government, and I see also what the others are doing. And if my government decided not to basically lift the restrictions when all others are doing, then I start to believe that something is going wrong. Then basically I feel legitimate to go after them. So from this point of view, of course, the governments had a certain advantage. There was no parliaments. People were fearful, so they were ready to listen to them. But this ended up on the first months. And then people started to compare all the time how their government performs in comparison with other governments. And by the way, this is one of the reasons authoritarian governments don't like this type of a crisis. Because being compared is something that authoritarian leaders don't like. By the way, the dictatorship of comparisons is the dictatorship that you have in the moment of a COVID-19. Everybody basically is saying, okay, why, for example, they open the shops in Greece and they're closing the shops in Bulgaria? Is the figures behind this? Is the government's kind of a bad intentions? And the last reason why the people have been empowered was that in a moment like this, any moment people decide not to do what the governments are doing is becoming critically powerful. And by the way, this is the other reason the authoritarian regimes have a problem, because in a democracy, you can be a weak government and you can survive. For example, imagine that President Macron said every Frenchman should have a face mask all the time. If half not to put their face masks, it's going to be embarrassment. But imagine if President Putin is going to say every Russian should have a face masks and half of them are not putting a face mask. This is a revolution. So from this point of view, the governments were very strong under pressure to perform, and they didn't have any chances to distract the public from the only thing that mattered. And the only thing that mattered is how you're dealing with the COVID-19. So from this point of view, yes, there are certain things that we could be worried about the concentration of power, but at the end of the day, even back then, I was not buying this kind of apocalyptic story that what we are seeing is normalization of the state of emergency, and this is the end of democracy, and we all are becoming a dictatorships and so on. So strangely enough, this is probably my most optimistic book of all. It happened during the COVID-19 because there was years ago an opinion poll being done about how pessimistic or optimistic are different nations in the world compared with their incomes. And the title in The Economist was The Optimists, the Pessimists, and the Bulgarians. And they discovered that Bulgarians were much more pessimistic that we should be back on our per capita income. So from this point of view, strangely enough, I needed the COVID-19 to become much more optimistic.
I think there is another point that relates to that, which is that now we've heard for the last 10 years about fake news and the spreading of lies, and you couldn't establish truth in democracies, and we were all and the public discourse was undermined by tech giants and lying and populists. And now you see in this crisis that knowledge of this pandemic and what should be done against it is spread all over the world, faster than the disease itself. And even people in Brazil or in America, everybody knows about the disease and they know what should be done. And if their leaders don't respond to it, they demand that they respond to it. So I've been thinking that this actually shows what a strong global public sphere we have. And it also shows the limits of manipulation of nationalist dictators or leaders.
You're right. At the same time, here I should tell you that on the basis of the survey that we did in Europe, the situation is not as optimistic as I expected. But you are right on one very important thing. When it comes to personal health, when it comes to public health, people are least ready to buy bullshit because they're going to pay with their life for this. But what is interesting is that when we did this survey, we discovered that Europeans are divided in three major groups. There are those who simply trust experts. They basically believe that medical doctors better than us know what should be done, and it's not bad to follow them, particularly if the COVID-19 is around. There is the people who don't trust any experts. And strangely enough, I do believe part of the problem with these people is that they don't understand how science works. Many of these people are going to say, oh, you had different doctors who have a different views. And because different doctors have a different views, then there is no scientific views, then the expert should not be trusted. But in a certain way, science works exactly because scientists do not agree with each other. And the idea, when there was one doctor in the village, so anytime when he was speaking, it was the medicine speaking itself. It's over. But the third group is much more interesting. These are people who basically believe that experts know better, but they were afraid that in the moment of the COVID-19, politicians, instead of being so much informed by the experts, are using the experts that are going to justify the decisions already taken. And this is particularly true in countries which are politically polarized, like the United States, like Poland, that this third group is so important. Because basically these people are not ready to make a distinction between the power coming from the expertise and the political power. It was always about the government and their doctors. So this is an interesting story. And to be honest, it partially explains part of the problem that the United States had during the COVID-19, because everything was totally politicized. For example, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask in New York at certain point was basically like going with your party affiliation. Having a mask means that you are a Democrat, and not having a mask that you are kind of a radical Republican. Yes. And this is very difficult, because when the identity politics and this type of a polarization goes in the sphere of public health, then we have a problem.
I have one last question for you. This COVID-19 crisis has also been a learning process. You've learned something about your societies. For instance, that America, even if they had a president who said, well, this is very serious, we must lock down, I'm not sure they actually have the capacity to take the consequence of that point, because half of their population wouldn't be able to pay their rent after 2 or 3 months. So actually and that also explains Bolsonaro. I mean, if he had the position of the Danish prime minister, it would be enormously socially harmful to the Brazilian population. And for me, that's been a great insight of this. Actually, there are limits to what you can do in America, because you need everyone working all the time. What have surprised you the most about the Western societies by this COVID-19 crisis?
Listen, it's a great point. And I do believe this is the difference between the initial weeks and later. In the initial weeks of the crisis, you're legitimate to do what others are doing. But after that, you should try to understand what is happening in your society. It is exactly very different how your economy looks like. What is the demographic profile of your population? What, by the way, is the level of solidarity? What I learned, and this is quite interesting, is that on one level, you can see that particularly when it comes to the European societies, we care about each other much more than we had feared. And even intergenerational relations were quite interesting. From this point of view, I do believe it's interesting to compare COVID-19 and the climate crisis. Because during the climate crisis, it is the young people who go on the street and tell to the older generation what you're doing. You're making us victims. We're vulnerable. Because of you, we're going to have a worse world. During COVID-19, it is the senior people who go and said, listen, be careful. We are much more vulnerable. Probably for you, it does not mean death, but for us, it can mean death. And I was very much moved to see during I don't have social media, I don't have a mobile phone. So from this point of view, I'm probably antique. But talking to my friends and parents, I understood one major divide when it comes to the lockdown. There were people that were much more saying we should keep closed as long as needed. The economic cost doesn't matter much. And there are people who said, listen, we should risk, we should go out. One of the major differences between these two groups was not education or profession, but are their parents alive? Those who have parents who are old and so on, they all the time thinking about COVID-19 was thinking about the vulnerability of their old parents. So they were ready basically for the economy to lose because, well, those people who basically are living in a different neighborhoods and they're there, they said, okay, we can risk, we can dare, we can do this or that. So for me, this was interesting. And also what was interesting was that in the European society, human life is a real value. The fact that the doctors, but even the governments, said that we should fight for the life of somebody who is 95 years old, the same way we are fighting for the life of somebody who is 25 years old, it really makes human life an absolute value. And from this point of view, I do believe Europe is quite unique.
Well, thank you very much. I love that we ended on an optimistic note. And who would thought you'd write a book about COVID-19? And it being your most optimistic book. And I should say, well, this is the wonderful book. And there's a 25% discount right now. Thank you very much, Ivan, for taking your time. It was great finally meeting you and talking to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really.